Part 1. The Gateless Gate. An invitation into the unnameable silence. Have you ever wondered if your pursuit of truth is the very thing keeping you from it? This is not merely a philosophical riddle. It is a trap buried in the foundations of every civilization. From the temples of Egypt to the monasteries of Japan, humanity has constructed systems, doctrines, and rituals in search of ultimate reality. But what if all these were walls built to enclose the very thing they sought to liberate? The ancient Greeks spoke of aletheia, not truth as information, but as unveiling, the stripping away of illusion. In India, the Upanishads tell us neti, neti, not this, not that, as if to remind us that the real cannot be contained in names. In Taoist China, Laozi warned, the Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao. And the Buddha, upon his awakening, said nothing for 7 days, not in arrogance, but because language itself had become too heavy. Zen, as it later emerged, is not a tradition that adds. It is a path that subtracts. It stands at the boundary where philosophy collapses and direct perception begins. This is why Bodhidharma, when asked who he was, replied simply, "I do not know." Imagine for a moment that every answer you have chased is a shadow on the wall of your own mental prison. And now, imagine that the gate of this prison, the one you have always tried to unlock, never existed to begin with. This is the gate that cannot be passed through because it was never closed. It is the gate of no entry, not because it denies you, but because you are already inside. What Zen calls the gateless gate, others might call the moment before thought arises, the breath before the word I forms. It is the silence before the gods were named. And yet, the paradox remains. You must walk through this gate, not by stepping forward, but by no longer stepping at all. The journey begins not where you go, but where you stop. The gateless gate is open, not because you have found the key, but because you no longer need one. Part 2. The inner labyrinth, descending the layers of knowing you have stepped through the gate. But what lies beyond is not a path. It is a descent. Not downward in space, but inward in being. A labyrinth not of walls, but of veils. Each turn reveals not more, but less. Less thought, less name, less self. Here, knowledge is not accumulated, it is peeled. What remains is not an answer, but a presence. In the silence beneath silence, the seeker begins to see. The truth is not hidden far away. It is hidden by everything we believe we already know. Let us begin the descent. Layer 1. The flame that sees, Bodhidharma, and the origins of stillness. If nothing changes when you awaken, have you truly awakened? This question is not merely abstract. It cuts into the center of every seeker's heart. We pursue transformation, imagining some glorious shift where the world becomes radiant, suffering vanishes, and we are finally complete. But what if awakening is not about change at all? What if it is the recognition that nothing ever needed to change? This paradox sits at the core of Zen, and its seed was planted by a man who crossed the Himalayas not to teach, but to sit. In the 6th century, a monk named Bodhidharma left India and traveled to China. According to tradition, he carried no scriptures, no disciples, no symbols of power, only the transmission of silent awareness passed down through 27 generations from Siddhartha Gautama himself. Bodhidharma is considered the 28th patriarch of Indian Buddhism. But what he brought to China was something older than Buddhism, older than language itself, the radical act of seeing without interpretation. The Chinese called this teaching Chen, which later became Zen in Japan. But the word itself is not the point. Bodhidharma's entire message could be summed in a single gesture. He sat facing a wall for 9 years. No movement, no sermon, no doctrine. This was not insanity. It was defiance. He rejected the elaborate rituals, metaphysical systems, and social hierarchies that Buddhism had become. He sat in the presence of reality itself, without clinging, without resisting. It is easy to dismiss this as extremism, but look closer. The ancient Egyptians built temples that aligned with the stars, not because they worshipped celestial bodies, but because they believed the sacred could only be accessed in stillness. In the Emerald Tablet of Hermes Trismegistus, we find the phrase, "as above, so below," not meaning spiritual escapism, but the idea that the microcosm, when undisturbed, reflects the macrocosm. In Vedic India, the rishis entered states of deep meditation, dhyana, to touch what they called Atman, the inner self that was one with Brahman, the All. Bodhidharma did not invent meditation, but he purified it, stripped it bare. He insisted that true insight was not acquired by reading sutras or bowing before statues. It came only by burning through illusion, by staring at the wall of one's own mind until the self vanished. One story tells of Emperor Wu of Liang, a devout Buddhist who had built countless temples and supported monks across his kingdom. When he met Bodhidharma, he asked, "What merit have I gained?" Bodhidharma answered, "None." Startled, the emperor demanded, "Who are you to speak this way?" Bodhidharma replied, "I do not know. These were not riddles. They were detonations." He was destroying the emperor's sense of self, of accumulation, of spiritual ego. To Bodhidharma, even the idea of spiritual progress was a trap. As long as one clings to the notion of gaining something, one remains in ignorance. And yet, this was not nihilism. He taught a fierce kind of clarity, a discipline not of belief, but of being. He trained the monks of Shaolin not only in seated meditation, but in physical rigor, creating the roots of what would become Shaolin martial arts. Why? Because even the body must become still through intentional movement. Stillness is not the absence of motion. It is the presence of undivided attention. His legacy did not end in China. Centuries later, his silence reached a young Japanese monk named Dogen, who asked, "If all beings possess Buddha nature, why practice?" The answer came not in words, but in Zazen, the seated meditation that Bodhidharma had embodied. Dogen realized that practice and realization are not two. One does not meditate to become enlightened. One meditates as the expression of enlightenment itself. This is where logic bends. This is where the ego panics. But let us be clear, this is not mystical nonsense. It is rigorous, logical even. In neuroscience, studies of long-term meditators reveal a quieting of the default mode network, the very system in the brain associated with self-referential thought. In silence, the illusion of the self begins to unravel. What remains is not nothingness, but an openness that perceives without filter. Bodhidharma's wall is not in China. It is in front of you now. Every moment you resist, what is every story you tell about yourself? Every spiritual ambition, every subtle comparison, you are staring at a mirror and calling it a wall. And when you finally stop, truly stop, the mirror does not disappear. It becomes a flame, and the flame sees you. Layer 2, the garden without name, Dogen and the disappearance of the self. If you let go of every belief about who you are, what remains? This is not a question of philosophy. It is a matter of identity, suffering, and liberation. Most people live with a silent assumption that there is a fixed self, somewhere inside, consistent, definable, nameable. Yet, when you search for this self, not through thought, but through direct observation, it slips through your fingers like smoke. So again, if the self cannot be located, who is asking the question? This was the riddle that haunted Dogen Zenji, one of the most revered Zen masters in history. Born into aristocracy in 13th century Japan, Dogen lost his parents at a young age. Standing before their funeral incense, he was not crushed by grief. He was pierced by a single destabilizing question. If all things are impermanent, what is the point of life? He entered the monastic path at age 13. Yet instead of peace, he found contradiction. Buddhist doctrine insisted that all beings possess Buddha nature, the capacity for enlightenment. But if that were true, why practice? Why meditate, study, or renounce if one is already whole? Unsatisfied with surface answers, Dogen traveled to China, where he encountered the Chen master Rujing. In a moment of instruction, Rujing said, "Cast off body and mind." These 5 words shattered Dogen's world. In that instant, he realized that there is no separation between practice and realization. You do not meditate to reach enlightenment. Meditation is itself enlightenment in motion. Across cultures, this insight has echoed. In the Advaita Vedanta tradition of India, the sage Ramana Maharshi advised seekers not to ask, "What is God?" but instead, "Who am I?" A question that, when followed to its root, dissolves the sense of a fixed self. The Sufi mystic Rumi wrote, "Try to be a sheet of paper with nothing on it. Be a spot of ground where nothing is growing." The message is the same. Your essence is not what you add, but what remains when everything false has been removed. Even in modern science, the concept of a stable self is under fire. Neuroscientists studying consciousness have found no central I in the brain. Instead, the sense of self emerges from moment-to-moment processes, sensations, thoughts, memories, none of which, individually, are you. The self, then, is not an entity. It is a story, and stories can be rewritten or abandoned entirely. Dogen did not stop at intellectual insight. He returned to Japan and founded the Aiheiji Monastery, where he dedicated his life to teaching Zazen-seated meditation as the direct expression of presence. But he also brought something deeper, a merging of enlightenment with ordinary life. To him, washing a bowl, sweeping the floor, cooking rice, these were not chores. They were sacred rituals of awareness. As he famously wrote, "To study the way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be awakened by all things." This is not abstract poetry. It is a radical reorientation of consciousness. Most people live in duality. Me versus world, subject versus object, observer versus observed. Zen, and especially Dogen's teaching, explodes this illusion. When you truly forget the self, there is no one left to be separate. The boundaries collapse. You do not look at the tree. You are the seeing of the tree. There is no longer a meditator meditating. There is only meditation. This is the garden without name, a metaphor for the state where no labels, no roles, and no identities are carried. Just as the Garden of Eden in the Judeo-Christian tradition was paradise before the knowledge of good and evil, the garden in Dogen's teaching is presence before division, not unconscious, but totally aware, aware without self-reference. And here's the paradox. Forgetting the self does not lead to emptiness. It leads to freedom. When you are no longer bound by your narrative, your roles, or your need to become someone, you can finally be, fully, authentically. And this presence is not passive, it is luminous, alive. Modern psychology, especially in mindfulness-based therapies, has confirmed this truth. People who develop the capacity to witness their thoughts without identification often report decreased anxiety, improved focus, and a deeper sense of well-being. The less they cling to their story, the more space they find in which to live. But Dogen went further. He challenged not only the self, but also time. He wrote, "Time does not pass. We pass through time." In his view, the present moment is not a fleeting instant between past and future. It is the entirety of existence. And when you inhabit it completely, you are not inside time. You are in eternity. So who are you, really? Not your name, not your past, not even your thoughts. You are the awareness in which all these arise. And when the story falls silent, the garden opens. No gate, no sign, no self, just the wind, and the sound of nothing naming it. Layer 3. The riddle without answer. The cone is a mirror that shatters the mind. What is the sound of one hand clapping? At first glance, this question seems absurd. It mocks logic. It defies language. But that is precisely the point. The question is not meant to be answered. It is meant to expose the limits of the mind that is asking. This is the cone, a Zen tool that is not a puzzle, not a metaphor, and certainly not a game. It is a surgical instrument designed to cut directly into the illusion of rational certainty. And for those who engage it sincerely, it can dismantle not only thought, but identity itself. Let us begin with clarity. A cone is not a riddle to be solved. It is a mirror, and the one being reflected is you. The moment you try to figure it out, you fall into the trap, because the cone is not asking for logic. It is demanding presence. It is not pointing to an answer. It is pointing to the mind that asks. This method is uniquely Zen, but the principle behind it is ancient. In the Greek philosophical tradition, Socrates used Elenchus-structured questioning to lead his students into a state of aporia, or productive confusion. He knew that knowledge begins not with certainty, but with disillusionment. Similarly, in the Kabbalistic tradition, seekers meditate upon paradoxical images of God male and female, light and darkness, form and formlessness, not to understand, but to unmake the duality in their own perception. In the Sufi path, the poet Hafiz asks, "What do sad people have in common? It seems they have all built a shrine to the past." This too is a kind of cone not to be decoded, but to be felt beyond the intellect. Back in Zen, the cone is more ruthless. One of the most famous is this: without moving your lips or tongue, say something about Zen. Or this: what was your original face before your parents were born? These are not abstract tricks. They are dynamite for the ego. Why? Because the ego is built on knowing, on having answers, forming opinions, creating identity structures that feel solid. But a cone exposes this solidity as fiction. When you face a cone, you are not solving a problem. You are being shown that you are the problem. Not in a moral sense, but in the sense that your habitual mind, your reflex to categorize, analyze, and define, is the very barrier to insight. Modern neuroscience supports this. The brain's left hemisphere is largely responsible for language, categorization, and linear logic. But deep meditative states often engage the right hemisphere, which is more intuitive, spatial, and holistic. When a cone short-circuits the left brain's attempt to define, the right brain may begin to perceive without filtering. What emerges is not an answer, but awareness itself. The Zen master does not expect you to say something clever in response to a cone. In fact, cleverness is considered a sign that the practitioner is still trapped in dualistic thinking. Real responses often come in silence or in spontaneous gestures that bypass the thinking mind entirely. One monk, when asked, "What is Buddha?" simply held up a flower. Another, when asked, "What is Zen?" threw his master's teacup on the floor. These are not performances. They are expressions from a mind that has stopped seeking and simply is. And yet, paradoxically, cones are part of a rigorous discipline. In the Rinzai school of Zen, students work with a master for years, presenting their understanding of a cone again and again, only to be turned away, pushed further, until the ego cracks. The teacher is not interested in whether the student gets it. They are waiting for the moment when there is no student left, only presence. One might ask, is this useful? Is it not more practical to study scripture, follow ethical rules, or develop compassion? But Zen would say, all of that is good, but unless you see what you are, deeply and directly, those practices remain external. They build a better cage, but they do not set you free. The cone, brutal as it is a key forged in paradox. It cannot unlock the door by force, but when held long enough, it may dissolve the door itself. Consider this. If you cannot explain truth in words, and yet truth is real, where does it reside? It resides in the gap, the pause between breaths, the silence before speech, the moment when the mind stops grasping. That gap is where the koan lives, not as information, but as invitation. The invitation is not to understand, it is to disappear, not to vanish in despair, but to dissolve into the seeing itself. When the riddle breaks you, what remains is not knowledge. It is clarity, no self, no answer. Only the sound of one hand not clapping, just being. Layer 4. The infinite in a bowl, the art of living, when a cup of tea becomes the cosmos. If everything is sacred, what is left to seek? This is not a poetic metaphor. It is a direct assault on the modern human condition. For most people, spirituality is something separate, something to do on weekends, to read about, to practice with intention in specific settings. But what if the most profound spiritual realization is this? There is no spiritual in ordinary life. There is only life seen clearly, lived fully, touched with presence. This truth is embedded at the heart of Zen, and it is not limited to monks or mystics. It appears in a bowl of rice, a pot of tea, the sweep of a broom. What makes these acts sacred is not the act itself, but the mind that performs them. Let us begin with an image. A monk kneels silently. He pours tea with slow, deliberate grace. There is no rush, no performance, no distraction. The sound of the water, the warmth of the bowl, the rising steam, these are not background noise. They are the ritual itself. This is Chanoyu, the Japanese tea ceremony, and it is one of the clearest embodiments of Zen in daily life. Every gesture, every breath, is an act of mindfulness. The goal is not entertainment, not even hospitality. It is a form of meditation, a way of being completely here. But this is not unique to Japan. In ancient Egypt, temple rituals were performed with extreme precision, not simply to appease gods, but to align human action with the rhythm of the cosmos. In classical Chinese philosophy, Confucius taught that true virtue begins with how one ties a sash or greets a guest. In Hinduism, the practice of karma yoga insists that every act, from washing the floor to tending a fire, is a form of offering when done without attachment. Zen takes this to its most distilled form. Enlightenment is not found in escaping life, but in entering it so fully that there is no longer a boundary between self and act. Dogen Zenji wrote, "When you wash the rice, just wash the rice." At first, this sounds simple, perhaps even simplistic, but it is a profound instruction. It means to perform each task with the full weight of attention, without projecting into the future or dragging along the past. To be present, fully and unapologetically, in what is. Modern psychology supports this with compelling evidence. Studies in mindfulness-based therapies show that people who train their attention toward the present moment often experience reductions in stress, anxiety, and depression. When we stop multitasking and attend to what is right in front of us, we begin to feel more grounded, more connected, more real. Zen takes this beyond therapy. It turns presence into a gateway to the infinite. Consider this. In a traditional Zen monastery, even the smallest actions, folding robes, arranging chopsticks, walking through a corridor, are governed by a kind of reverent precision. This is not about control. It is about harmony. The idea is that every action reflects the entire universe. There is no hierarchy of moments, no task too low. The sacred is not reserved for altars. It flows through everything. This idea is echoed in indigenous traditions around the world. The Lakota people of North America speak of walking in beauty, a way of moving through life with reverence for the land, the breath, the animal, the sky. In West African spiritual systems, drumming, dancing, and food preparation are not chores. They are acts of alignment with ancestral rhythm. Even in the Christian mystic tradition, Brother Lawrence, the 17th century monk, spoke of practicing the presence of God while doing dishes in a monastery kitchen. So why does this matter? Because we live in a culture that fragments experience. We separate work from life, secular from sacred, art from function. This division creates alienation. We begin to treat daily life as a series of obligations, rushing through moments as if they were mere means to some distant, better future. Zen offers another way. There is no better moment than this one, and this one, and this one. That is why a cup of tea is not a symbol. It is the whole thing. When you hold it with awareness, you are holding the water, the fire that boiled it, the potter who shaped the bowl, the sun that nourished the leaves, the wind that carried the seed. All of it is here. This is not imagination. It is perception when the filters of habit and ego fall away. And so, when the Zen master says, before enlightenment, chop wood and carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood and carry water. He is not being cryptic. He is revealing the most profound truth of all. Nothing changes. You do. The bowl remains a bowl. But now, it contains everything. The infinite is not somewhere else. It is in your hands, right now. Part 3. The door you cannot exit. You do not need to go anywhere. You only need to be here. If there is no separation between you and truth, what is the point of the journey? This question unravels the entire architecture of spiritual seeking. For centuries, humanity has climbed mountains, crossed deserts, built temples, and followed teachers in search of enlightenment. But what if the one who seeks is the very veil that hides what is already present? In Zen, this is not a metaphor, it is a living paradox. You cannot arrive at what never left you. You cannot escape from what you already are. The gate you long to pass through was never closed. The door you seek to exit does not exist. Across civilizations, mystics have echoed this realization. In the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus says, "The kingdom is spread out upon the earth, and men do not see it." In the Hindu tradition, the Atman, the true self, is not gained, but recognized. The Kabbalists describe God not as a distant being, but as Ein Sof infinite presence that permeates all. The Tao Te Ching begins. The Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao. Why? Because the moment you name it, you step outside of what it already is. The logical conclusion is startling. You do not need to awaken to reality. You need to stop denying it. Modern science supports this, not as dogma but as insight. Neuroscience shows that the brain does not perceive the world directly. It filters, edits, distorts. What we call reality is a construction. But when we release those filters through practices like meditation, the boundaries begin to dissolve. What emerges is not hallucination, but a quieter, clearer sense of presence. And so, the path is not forward, it is inward. The goal is not change. It is seeing without seeking. You do not step through the final door. You recognize you are always on the other side. The journey ends where it began, in this breath, in this body, in this now, not exit, but entry.